I used to read every night. I devoured books. There was one book written by a man whose name was Karl May, who had committed some fraudulent thing and was in jail. And he wrote 60 books covering things all over the world. And he was always a hero. In America, he was Shadowhand. And his best Indian friend name was Winnetou. So I devoured those books. But in the process of devouring those books, I got a knowledge of geography and history which was absolutely mind-boggling. Because beside of his personal bragging, he really covered the history of the area he wrote about. So it was America, it was Morocco, it was Kurdistan, areas I never knew existed. And I always had to go and find a map to look up where he wrote about. And it really gave me an insight into history and into travel, into geography, and they were always my major subjects in which I was very good. Strangely enough, I'm very bad at math today, but in algebra I used to be very good as a child. I enjoyed it. What I particularly enjoyed was geometry. I was brilliant at it. And even as a child I always drew. I remember a teacher, once I did a book, sketched a book of a little bee which was called Queen Maya. And I did a whole children's book, and my teacher in elementary school asked me to give it to him. And it was one of the heartbreaking things for me to give up that book, but I finally let him have it, because he really wanted it so much. And so the interesting part was, except for children calling me Jew when I played with them, I really had no personal feeling of anti-Semitism. I had a good time. I played. I had a lot of buddies with which I played. And so, till I went to Palestine, I really had a very good life at home. I had a loving mother who spoiled me like hell. Every morning she brought me a nugget, which was a special kind of chick of chocolate mixture, something on the thin wafers. And it was absolutely delicious. My father spoiled me. I remember every time we went on a business trip, first time I asked him, what did you bring me? So I had a very good childhood, and I really had no bad experience emotionally. And while many Jewish kids who came from Germany had a traumatic experience, I never did.
So this was
one thing I remember from elementary school that made a very deep impression of mine. One of the children I always gave sandwiches to took me to his home, and I was absolutely aghast. It was a bare rooms. There were no chairs, no tables. All they had were boxes. Boxes that served as chairs, a bigger box that served as a table, and no beds. The poverty was incredible. Up to that time I had no idea what poverty actually meant. And my sister at that time belonged to a socialist youth movement, and she convinced me to become a socialist. I remember I was 8 years old. And she gave me literature to distribute. And there was a meeting of the equivalent of the National Manufacturers Association, which met at Bingham Big Hotel. And I stood there handing out leaflets, and suddenly and people took it. And suddenly, as I looked up, I saw I gave a leaflet to my father, who took me home and gave me the spanking of a lifetime. So that was my introduction into the political scene of that period. And things started to get worse. I heard songs like, "Nothing will be better till Jewish blood spritz from our knives," and things like this. and Horst Wessellied, I don't remember the words. But things got worse and worse and worse, and I became the only Jew staying at my Realschule because I wanted to become an engineer. And the interesting thing was, every time that somebody picked on me, because I was Jewish obviously, my class surrounded me, made a circle to assure that nobody else would get into the act. And what I remember is beating up the Nazi leader's son, and then when we went back into the classroom, getting a lecture from the professor, said, "Do I realize what I had done?" I said, I didn't do anything wrong. He picked on me. He started a fight with me, what I was supposed to do. And so that was the situation. It got worse and worse and worse.
What did the teachers say?
He was actually concerned about his own skin. I realized now, because he was afraid that the Nazi leader would retaliate against him and the school, permitting something like this to happen. But I'm very sure his son never dared to tell his father that a Jew beat him up. But almost every day on my way to school, kids were waiting for me to beat me up. And I had already a system. I had a heavy leather belt with a metal buckle, which was from my father's uniform from World War I. And the moment they got to me, off came the belt around my hand, and I whipped it around, and I normally beat them up. Sometimes I got beaten up too, but by and large, it became that actually the kids were afraid of me. And things got worse, as I said.
How old were you?
I must have been at least 10 years old to go to the Realschule. And I remember I had only one friend. His name was Hans Eckes. His father had been killed in an accident. He was a driver for one of the owners of a competitive winery. And I remember he came to me and said, "Fritz, I'm not allowed to play with you anymore because they have approached me, the Nazis have approached me, said I'm not allowed to play with a Jew." So that must have been, I must have been at least 12 by that time. So I campaigned at home to leave and go to Palestine. Partly because I belonged to the Jewish Scouts, Boy Scouts. Partly I had a short spell of turning or becoming very religious. I mean, I went to the synagogue every Friday night with my parents and every Saturday, and we kept every holiday. But I got bored of it, so I forgot about it. But what I did not forget, that I got an insight into our history, an insight into what is happening in the world, and to a large extent from my sister, who was politically very active. As a matter of fact, when Hitler came to power, she had to flee over the border to Switzerland with her future husband, or she would have been killed, because she was a student, socialist student leader at the University of Freiburg. She went to a Swiss college in Bern, and then from there she went to an Italian college, a university in Bologna. And she studied medicine and he studied medicine. They both became doctors. And I remember seeing my sister in Bologna after the Nazis smashed my parents' home, and both my sister and I tried to convince them to go either to America or go to Palestine, but they would have had to do it illegally. We could have arranged it. My father was not willing to do anything, quote unquote, that was illegal. My mother was willing to do it. And had they gone, they would have survived. As a matter of fact, my father visited me in Ben Sherman, and I remember him telling me, how I don't want my son to be a farmer. He wanted to take me to Oxford.